everybody. Welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. It is episode 64, and, well, in the United States anyway, it's Thanksgiving. And we all sit around the table, stuff ourselves with turkey, and watch football, and commemorate the time when the Pilgrims had their butts saved by the Native Americans, the Wampanoag tribe. I'm probably mispronouncing that. And basically taught them how to grow corn and grow food and all kinds of stuff and save them from that rough winter. Well, this is the lumber industry update. So I'm here to tell you that the Pilgrims, they were lumber merchants, folks. They certainly were separatists. They were trying to find religious freedom, all the stuff that we've heard. But their trip on the Mayflower, their trip over to the U.S. or North America, it wasn't the U.S. then, that was financed by the Plymouth Company. And the Plymouth Company, they wanted those Pilgrims to send them stuff. You know, okay, we're going to pay for you to go over there in the Mayflower. We're going to pay for you to set up this, forward operating base. But we want you to send us furs, and mostly we want you to send us timber. Because you see, the British, they were kind of already out of wood at this point. They kind of ran out of wood in the 1500s. When you think about all of the harvesting, first of all, think about England. It's a tiny little island comparatively, and there'd been harvesting of the forests since the Middle Ages. And as you moved into the age of exploration, and the British built, this big, powerful navy, and they kept shooting at the French, and the French kept shooting back, and the Spanish Armada kept shooting at them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You had to constantly keep rebuilding those ships. You also had to keep building homes for this blossoming empire that you had, and the burgeoning population, and yet you still want to live on a little island with the forests all gone. So by the 1600s, when the Pilgrims were landing in Plymouth Colony, timber was a major, major demand from England. And, certainly the Pilgrims and the Plymouth Colony weren't the first timber merchants. Maybe you call them one of the first timber merchants. Certainly Jamestown had been pushing out lumber for a couple decades, I think. I'm getting my dates mixed up now. I just remember 1607 for Jamestown. I want to believe the Pilgrims, we're talking 1620s. Someone's going to correct me on that. But regardless, they weren't the first, but they were essentially lumber merchants. Now, not everybody on the Mayflower were religious separatists. Certainly the Plymouth Company sent along some, call them contractors, who were going to be bringing back some material. Fur traders, trappers, they were going to be specializing in exporting back fur and material. And you had a couple lumber guys that came along as well in order to make sure that they were bringing back quality materials. But ultimately, it was up to not only the crew of the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, everybody on the ship, to make the colony successful, to meet the demands of their backers, their financial backers, the Plymouth Company, and start sending timber. And that really, when you look at any colony in North America at the time, that's what it was all about. It was about getting timber and sending it back. Certainly, there were new species that the British, and for that matter the Europeans, weren't really aware of, but they saw these enormous forests, huge virgin trees, and really began to think, oh my goodness, there's our salvation. We finally have oak for our ships. We have this incredibly large white pine that's perfect for the masts of our sailing ships. Firewood, folks. I mean, you're talking the age of industrialism. As you move further along, you needed firewood to power the foundries for making steel and things like that. Firewood was a major demand, and you could easily chop it up, put it on a ship, and send it back over to Europe and to Great Britain. So it's kind of interesting to think about the Pilgrims and the whole story, the romanticized story we have of the first Thanksgiving. And really behind all that was the lumber industry saying, get us some material. I think eventually the Plymouth Company was so displeased with the returns they were getting that the Pilgrims were actually able to buy out their contract. And I'm sure the Plymouth Company just kind of wrote it off as a bad debt because, frankly, most of the Pilgrims weren't lumber people. They were worked more in the textile industry, and they were farmers and things like that. They didn't really know anything about, certainly they knew how to cut down trees, I think, as any self-respecting person of the day knew how to do that. But as far as selecting material for masts, selecting the right white pine for a mast, selecting the right cedars for used below the waterline in some of the ships, selecting the right oaks, differentiating between white oak and red oak was obviously a big deal because you were using white oak in your ships, and white oak was the closest semblance to the English oak, Quercus robur, similar to red oak, Quercus rubra, but very, very different. As we know, North American red oak has big, wide open pores that funnels water straight through it, but it also has a high tannin count, which makes it fantastic for the coopers in making barrels. And other things that were coming out of the colonies at the time, sugar, tapping all those maple trees, making sugar, all of the tobacco, everything needed to have those red oak casks or barrels, however you want to call them, made in order to ship back to Europe. It was absolutely important. But you needed people with a certain amount of specialization in the lumber trade in order to diagnose the best trees to fell, to best mill or saw the trees into something that could be stacked on a ship and not absolutely destroyed. You think about our modern times, felling a tree, sawing a tree into boards and getting it into a kiln quickly to produce the best grade, to produce the least amount of kiln defect. They didn't have any of that stuff going on. They were cutting stuff down, sawing it into boards, throwing it on a ship, and in some instances shipping logs, but a lot of times they were being sawn at least or hewn into cants because you can stack cants. You put a bunch of logs on a ship, you got to take a lot of extra steps in order to prevent them from rolling around. You get the mass off center, that poor ship can end up capsizing. So all kinds of things had to be done to the material just to be put on a ship. Well, then it's stuck in the hold of a ship as it sails back across the Atlantic Ocean, and Lord knows what kind of defects are going on within the wood itself. So there were lumber specialists that were in charge of processing the material, and the Pilgrims, they didn't have any of those. So yeah, long story short, the Plymouth Company said, sorry guys, we're writing you off. We're calling you a tax deduction now. And yeah, you go ahead and buy out your contract and good riddance because you're terrible lumber people. But really, this was, a timber export schema. It was a campaign to bring more material in. And I tell you what, the British quickly discovered the magic of the poplar. Poplars don't grow in England. I remember Roy Underhill once saying that the mountains go the wrong way. The mountains face the wrong direction to allow the poplar to grow. And it's not there, at least at the time. There may be some that have been transplanted in England now, but poplar, as we know, fast growing, relatively short-lived, but enormous tree. And a lot of good uses for many, many different household things. Also can be used for clapboard siding and things like that. And you cut one down and another one grows back. Within 5 years, it's almost ready for harvest again. And poplars today are enormous. You can only imagine what they were like in the 16 and 1700s, just how big they were. As I said earlier, the white pines were harvested and kept in as long and as straight and close to the log as possible, used for sailing ship masts. That was one of the biggest things that the British Admiralty was seeking from these timber contracts that were over in North America at the time. Cedars were found all over the place. Atlantic white cedar, primarily what we're talking about. Obviously, Western red came much, much later as we moved to westward expansion, but that Atlantic white cedar was fantastic for its water resistant nature. So a lot of the stuff that was below the waterline in ships was white cedar. Cypress, you were starting to see from some of the southern colonies. You're starting to see it from places like the Jamestown colony and points south. But when we're talking Massachusetts and we're focusing on the Pilgrims because it's Thanksgiving, not a whole lot of cypress going on. But walnut, oh, absolutely. Walnut was highly prized. It's so funny because we think of we fast forward a little bit and think of, 18th, 17th century you think of mahogany and furniture being made out of mahogany. Well, mahogany had been used for furniture for centuries. In fact, there's a lot of people that claim some of the golden age of furniture wasn't actually genuine mahogany, but it was African species like sapele and utile, because those reddish woods have been coming out of Africa far longer than the wood had been coming out of North America. But the funny thing is even though we associate mahogany with that time period, walnut was highly prized. The walnut market was much stronger. The pricing on walnut was much higher than that of mahogany because it was a heck of a lot harder to get. There were established trade routes coming out of Central America and the Caribbean, sending mahogany into Europe, but also well-established trade routes out of Africa, as I said, bringing that red wood in. You bring walnut along, and even today, walnut is quite unique with that brown color. There are very few trees in the world that have that natural brown color, and man, was it popular. You throw a couple of coats of button lac over top of that, and you've got this deep red-brown lustrous wood that makes incredible furniture. So walnut was, and funny, still today, one of the prized species that was being pulled out of North America, and the British were nuts for it, clamoring for this stuff. As much as they could get their hands on, they wanted more and more of it. Maple, certainly, it became super popular for its extractive maple syrup, the sugars. It was like the number one sweetener throughout the 1600s and in the 1700s. It was, and you think about in modern parlance, you think of all the sea salts and exotic spices and things, and we market them by saying, oh, it's from these far-flung regions of the world. Well, back then, it's like, not only is this sweetener in your tea, this is fine Massachusetts Bay Colony maple sugar, and I can see the copywriting now in the London Times saying that, buy John Smith's authentic Massachusetts Bay Colony sweetener. So it is interesting when you think of the Thanksgiving story. There's no one really ever talks about the fact that they were really there to export lumber. This was kind of the beginnings of the timber trade, and one might say the beginning of the end, because things got really out of control really fast with over-harvesting. We're still a couple hundred years away from that, but this was the beginning of the boom. This was the beginning of this thought that, North America has endless forests and we'll never run out there and we can just go crazy and chop all this stuff down. But it was particularly interesting when you look at the species that didn't exist in the UK and didn't really exist in Europe. Things like hickory, chestnut. Chestnut was another one that the British Admiralty loved to use below the waterline on their ships. But hickory, American hornbeam, both of those became this like boom in tool making. The super, super dense, hard nature of American hornbeam. Heck, my Lie-Nielsen chisels have hornbeam handles on them. Even today, hornbeam is still used as a great, super dense, very homogeneous grain tool making wood. Hickory, from baseball bats to axe handles, maybe not baseball bats back in the 1600s, but axe handles. The Native Americans were using split hickory for like spear shafts and arrows and things like that. Speaking of arrows, I also find it funny. Essentially, the first Thanksgiving was a celebration of the forming of an alliance, like a modern day reality show. The Wampanoag tribe and the Pilgrims formed an alliance against another tribe that they were fighting with. So there's the dark underbelly of that story. They were celebrating getting together to go beat up on somebody else, I suppose. But I'm not here to dispel and ruin the romanticized version of Thanksgiving. I do just find it particularly interesting, and I can only imagine being a British colonist at the time, being faced with these massive forests and thinking, my Lord, like, first of all, I don't even know what that tree is, but dang, it's big. And cutting down some of these species and splitting them into wood or sawing them or hewing them into clapboard siding for their homes and things like that, and never having worked with walnut or American black cherry or this incredible northeastern white pine that they didn't have. Finding a hickory tree for the first time and splitting that and watching it pop apart like it's, a perforated edge, and then seeing just how flexible and how strong it was. Again, I mentioned the poplar already. You can imagine the amount of serving bowls and spoons that were carved from the poplar tree, the amount of clapboard siding that was made from poplar, from red oak, from white oak, from chestnut. These are all species that these colonists had no prior experience with. Now, some of them may have had some experience with oak, certainly English oak, some might call it brown oak. And you think, okay, well, here's another oak, and there were subtle differences. English oak is, I guess it's closest to be compared to white oak. Certainly from a density perspective, it's much similar. You find that English oak has tighter growth rings, a little bit more homogeneous texture to it when you work with it. Granted, my only experience with English oak is modern English oak. I didn't have any experience working with English oak from 300 years ago, but definitely major difference between that and red oak, English oak and red oak, that is. Hardness is actually softer than the softest of those three species, red, white, and English oak. It's about 100 less on the Janka scale than red oak. But that lovely smooth consistency that you get with white oak, even to a greater degree with English oak, really kind of spoiled a lot of the British. And then they started working with red oak and quickly realized, okay, this is a totally different bird. It's oak, but it's not the same. And I would love to know who first thought, well, let's make a barrel out of it. And who first realized the incredible extractive nature of the high tannin count in red oak and what it could actually do to things like tobacco, to the export of so many of the different goods that relied upon hogsheads and barrels and things like that. And then having the British Navy coming in and saying, okay, let's cut down this oak, because this white oak, because this is the closest to English oak. But even then, seeing the subtle differences, shipbuilding trade started up all up and down the East Coast, because this was one of the best ways to export lumber for making the British Navy, was to take that lumber and build it into a ship first, then sail it across the Atlantic Ocean. So you started to see the British Admiralty sending over shipwrights as colonists and harvesting this boon of material in order to make the British Navy right there on the shores of North America. And to have some shipwright who has done his apprenticeship and his journeyman and spent all his time working with English oak, suddenly to be completely transported to a different species. Not only was he working with a different species, his tools had different species in the handles. That would just be kind of amazing. And I kind of fast forward to today, and I think about how fortunate I am to be able to have exposure to a lot of different woods working for a lumber company, but also just, the internet has democratized and opened up the buying of wood, so you can buy from all over the world and get exposure to so many different species. But back then, you might have worked with one or two species, whatever was out your door, and that's what you were stuck with. To be transported thousands of miles across the ocean and have an entirely new palette of woods to choose from must have been like a kid in a candy store, to begin to discover all the differences, not only the differences in species, but just the sheer size of the trees in North America. The virgin forest, just massively tall, wide trunk trees with zero branches, completely straight grain material. And you can imagine a shingle maker or clapboard siding sitting there with a froe, just splitting material after material, this long straight grain stuff, and just thinking he died and gone to heaven. Suddenly his shingle production just went up tenfold because the lumber, especially the Atlantic white cedar they were using, was just splitting if you looked at it wrong. Just that would be so cool. Sorry, I'm waxing philosophical here, but it is interesting to think of the story of the first Thanksgiving and recognize that what funded it was the lumber industry. So again, if we think about this explosion of the timber trade because of these untapped forests of North America, fast forward through some of the gross negligence of harvesting through the 1800s and the early 1900s. But then we look at it from the perspective of the 21st century and the regulation of harvesting that has caused, and the protection of a lot of forests that have caused a rebounding in a number of species, and the sustainably managed silviculture that exists in North America today. And it is kind of exciting because, as I said earlier, the internet opened up the global species to so many people, and exotics, at least exotics in North America, became all in vogue, and designers wanted all of these species from all over the place. And unfortunately, that has produced some negative results on those forests in other parts of the world. But what I find particularly interesting, and as we are coming to the close of 2021, and maybe I'll do kind of a predictions episode as we close out this year, but I am seeing a trend back towards the domestics, the North American domestics, in the North American market, that is. This fascination with the enormity of the trees that naturally grow in North America, that's still there, people. It's not that the trees, you go to a lumber yard and you think, oh, these boards are skinny and the grade is bad and you just can't get them like they used to. More often than not, that's not true. What has happened is the market has said there's a demand for this particular width and this particular length, or the market has pigeonholed the species into a certain application. So the sawmills are sawing those boards in to meet that particular application. So it's not that there's not wide walnut out there or wide cherry or anything. It's that the market doesn't really demand that. And the sawmills can saw them into specific sizes, get a better yield for their tree, but also make a higher profit from some of that. But back to my trending idea, as well, COVID and supply chain restrictions have really thrown a monkey wrench into the exotic market over the last year. And we're seeing some major political changes around protection of some of these forests that is going to make the exotic market, well, go up in price pretty dramatically, but also become even less available. And that could be a very, very good thing from an environmental perspective, but it could be a very scary thing from a lumber perspective. And because of that, more and more people are turning their sights back to the material that's here on our own shores. And with the sustainable practices that have been put into place over the last 100 years, and with a greater eye towards sustainability, if we're going to cut down this tree, what are we doing not to eliminate that resource in order to have that resource available to us 5 years, 20 years, 50 years into the future? The science is clear in that respect, and proper management of forests can very easily be done, as well as managing the demand from the industry itself. So because of that, we're starting to look more at some of our domestic species. And I think we're going to see greater, how shall I say this, specialization of some of those species. And it could be really exciting. Instead of just being able to buy cherry or being able to buy maple, we might actually start to see subdivisions within that market where suddenly rift cherry becomes something that's more available, or a greater expansion in the grades. FAS doesn't really cut it. It's not really descriptive anymore of what can be available. And we've seen little sub-pockets of grading like 80-20, 80% heart, 20% sap cherry, or all heart cherry. Those little things that don't really have any standardization, official designation, but are kind of being used at the grassroots level among various lumber yards could suddenly become the thing. I'm just sticking with cherry at this point, and it's interesting because cherry is kind of depressed in the market right now, and it's not being spec'd by a lot of designers. But say that begins to turn around and we start to, instead of just seeing cherry spec'd on things, we're spec'ing specific color grades of cherry or specific cuts of cherry. So now the lumber yards, in response to that market demand, aren't just carrying rough sawn cherry anymore. They're carrying cherry in flat sawn, quartered, rift, all heart, 50% heart. Even better could be a surge in the use of cherry sapwood. So now that single rack that used to just have 4/4 cherry on it could be broken into 6 different racks with different subgrades and grains and cuts of cherry available. That to me could be really exciting as a woodworker, to be able to walk into a lumberyard and have my choice of a lot of those things. Don't get me wrong, we have some of that choice now, but you dig through the pack and you have to do a fair amount of rummaging around in order to find it. If the market says there's a demand for, say, riffs on cherry, you're going to see lumber buyers, sawyers looking for that, speccing it, sawing, taking advantage of, frankly, the greater profits that can come from that specialization of rift. But all the way up the supply chain, you're going to see a greater attention to detail in the growing and the harvesting of the tree in order to maximize that particular cut. And I'm just talking about cherry at this point, but this could extend to white oak, it could extend to white pine. All of these domestic species that have kind of become a commodity, kind of become blasé because you've got this huge world of exotic material out there, could have a total renaissance. And I actually see that happening relatively soon. I'm already seeing it amongst some designers that are starting to spec more and more domestics, but not just by species. They're speccing the species and the cut and the grain and all of that. You know, they're being very, very specific, and it's forcing the supply chain of the lumber industry to respond to that. So long departure from talking about the first Thanksgiving in the Pilgrims and one of the first lumber trades that started here in North America, but we saw this pendulum swing that way, and the total demand for North American domestics was huge back in the 1600s, and it started to wane, and now I see the pendulum swinging back the other way, and I see domestics becoming a lot more popular. So we shall see, folks, what happens. And yay, it's a holiday, so I'm going to keep this episode a little bit short. If you have comments, please, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear where I got my historical inaccuracies in this episode as well. But just remember, as you're sitting down to eat your turkey, that Pilgrims were lumbermen too. So go buy some lumber, folks.